welcome to the ABA Inside Track Book Club discussion of Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. How are you doing? I'm your host for this fabulous discussion of Neurotribes. We assume it will be. We haven't done it yet. What?
You're like doing the upfront sell on your own.
It's going to be the best podcast you ever did here about Neurotribes. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie, coming from your library live.
That's right. And we're also joined by our special guest. It's his second book club appearance. We are very excited to have him back. Special guest, please introduce yourself.
Alan Haberman, special educator, at least formerly, and just slogging my way slowly to becoming a behavior analyst too.
Woo!
Oh boy. So
You're almost there.
So close. So we are here talking to, this is just going out on the Patreon. It's going to be our nice long discussion of the book Neurotribes. This is our second one of these. We're going to be talking all about how many pages is this book? Like 400, 500? It feels longer. I don't know what they did with the margins.
548.
It's a very long book.
Not as long as Bleak House. Bleak House is 1,000 pages. I had to read that for a class.
We'll put Bleak House on the next poll.
Class.
The next poll, we'll put Bleak House. Dickens. Behavior analysis in Dickens will be our next. Nope. Not interested.
Just a lot of punishment.
There actually is only 484 pages of written text.
Okay, so it's like only half the length of Bleak House.
It's only halfway there. So this is, like I said, a book club for our patrons. We're going to be talking all about Neurotribes, book that was voted on by listeners and by us. Well, we skewed the vote by saying, "Hey, everybody, why don't you vote for Neurotribes?" We used our position to try to pressure everyone into voting for it. Some people did not, so they were not susceptible.
That's right. We're proud of you. We're
proud of you for going against the grain. But you know what? I think there was a lot of push for Neurotribes also from us. So this is a book, the subscript of the title, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, I think sort of sums up what we'll be discussing tonight, because this is not a behavior analytic book exactly. However, we all agree, regardless of the fact that I think we all have some points that might detract a little bit from our enjoyment of reading the book, that there is so much in here for anyone who is interested in or currently working with autistic individuals. There's a lot here that you may not have learned in graduate school or your training programs, or you may not have just, picked up along the way. So there's a lot of value in this tome. So I guess we should just get going, because we only got so much time and we've got hundreds and hundreds of pages to cover. So let's start with a little background information on Neurotribes. And so there's a great preface where author Steve Silberman sort of talks about why he wrote the book. But right before we started recording, Alan let us know that he actually had seen Steve Silberman talk. And it was Tech Saba. You said, Alan, you saw him?
Well, it was the Texas Autism Conference.
Texas Autism Conference. Sorry. And he spoke about writing this book. So, Alan, I'm just going to let you start us off with kind of tell us, what Steve Silberman talked about the genesis of writing Neurotribes.
Yeah, I think for the important thing to know about Steve Silberman is that he's not a behavior analyst. He's not a person with autism or he's not neurodiverse in any way that he considers notable. He's a science writer. He studied English Lit, I think at Berkeley. And, so this is not his passion in life was not to become an autism advocate. But in writing an article for Wired in 2001 about what he called the Geek Syndrome, which was about, what was then called Asperger's syndrome, he just met a lot of people in Silicon Valley who were on the Asperger's spectrum and who had children with more with autism, but with more significant needs than what we associate with Asperger's syndrome. And so he wrote that article and he was getting every day an email about it. He thought, well, maybe this is something I should explore and turn into like a book. And this might be something worth me pursuing beyond just an article. And so, that brought, he came in contact with Temple Grandin a lot, became really involved in the autism rights movement, which we see a lot in here and in the book. And it's just fascinating the way that he's very clear that he is, what is the quote that I have? He's not making light of autism. He's just advocating for understanding. And I really like that he really humble in what he's trying to do. He's not trying to like be in people's face. He's like, we should really understand people with autism and the role that they have and deserve in our society, and how that to be better, not just for people with autism, but people with ADHD and people with all different types of neurological or psychological disabilities. He talked. It was fascinating to hear him talk about people like Lorna Wing in the book about, we thought autism was a super rare thing based on institutionalization rates. And it turns out it's about 1 in every 1 to 200 people, which is similar to what we see now. How did we go, all of basically human history without, human history without having an idea that these people were around? He's also very clear that things like waiting for medical science isn't enough, that we need supports now, which is a big part of the disability rights, separate but not separate. Separate is not equal. That people with disabilities don't have to wait for society to catch up to them. We need to do it actively now. And he just talked a lot about the people that he's encountered over the years. Talked a lot about people like Asperger and Leo Connor and the harm that they often did in sort of being these lone wolves in psychology. And they're going to like lead this big breakthrough when we had an idea of the needs of people with autism and effective therapies before the Second World War. We just went on this psychoanalytic, what's the word? Segue, and it didn't help anybody. And then just was a sort of a breakdown of the book in general, which we'll sort of talk about. But it was just really fascinating. It didn't feel like he was trying to sell his book. He just really is, someone with a passion for journalism and like a very creative soul. He's a very humble guy. I think his husband is a high school science teacher. So that, he's just a cool person, like what you would meet, who used his pulpit for expanding society and making it more diverse.
You definitely get the sense of the book that he was just so passionate about the topic, and that sort of, it's in some ways it makes the book read a lot easier. I think some chapters read a little more like, I got so excited about this tangent, so here's a whole chapter about it, and you're sort of, oh, okay. I maybe wish you'd used this time to write about something, a different part of the scope, the scope of the issue of autism and autistic rights. But, it's hard to get frustrated with someone who clearly is just so excited to share all of this information. And when I was reading the acknowledgments, he definitely was trying to talk with lots of different people. This isn't a book where it's, I just talked to scientists, or I just talked to researchers, or I just talked to any one group. A lot of families, a lot of parents of autistic children, a lot of autistic adults. I thought it was funny. I was reading the acknowledgments, and he thanked Colin Malloy, who is the lead songwriter and lead singer of the band The Decemberists. And that sort of led me down a rabbit hole. I didn't know that Colin Malloy has an autistic child, and had done some interviews with some of the autism networks online. And so apparently had discussions with him about his own experience. Didn't even make it in the book. But got a special thanks in there. So there must be
too bad. I love
so much.
Decemberists.
I don't know if they're going to talk about this. Tell me more about what's our album that we love. Tell me more about Picaresque. How did you develop? Tell me about the Crane Wife.
One of my favorite articles reviewing Decemberists called him donkey voice singer Colin Malloy, which is really neither here nor there, but it's the only thing I've contributed thus far.
Well, I think we should take a Steve Silberman approach to this discussion, and just if we have a topic that we want to talk about for 500 pages, you know what, we're going to do it. We're just going to go.
All right, so I'll say my piece now. I think we're going to review this book, and I think we'll need to be careful in our balancing of our critique of the book as a literary work versus our critique of the messages that he's attempting to portray.
Yes.
In the book. And there's some of each.
Yes.
The other piece I want to make sure I say here at the beginning is one of our listeners brought up the question of how much do we love the title Neurotribes? Is that potentially appropriative of Native American groups by calling this Neurotribes?
I was expecting it to be a post-apocalyptic thriller about a variety of tribes of neurodiverse groups fighting it out for the scant resources left on planet Earth.
Joke to me for a while.
And I was a little disappointed. This big old science book.
I do think it's important to acknowledge that maybe since this was written, that people had maybe thought about that term a little bit more, and he might have chosen something different if it were written in 2020.
And just to push back in a sort of conversational way, the term tribe is not, the term tribe is from like Greco-Roman history. It's like the tribe, the tribune, and the tribe of the different social ranks in Roman society, especially. So I think it's very much true that we need to be aware of that. But the word tribe has been used in art and literature beyond the Native American experience and then just indigenous experience in general. So I didn't clue into that just because I'm used to the term tribe outside of that and having a very narrow understanding of that word in its sort of history. So that didn't even occur to me.
Yeah, no, that's a good point to bring up too. But I just thought I'd throw it out there in case anyone else had rubbed anyone else the wrong way, like it had our other listeners.
So one thing that I found when I first looked at the book, the first time I picked up this book, I think it was last year at some point, and I was reading it, is I thought the book was going to be about animal species with different genomes that would mark similar
from the cover
autistic individuals because of the cover. So I was like, oh,
got a real Silent Spring look to it.
Right, because there's birds and butterflies, and I was like, oh, fascinating. I wonder if they're the future of neurodiversity. Are they going to tie the diverse natures of the animal species and how they have evolved, right? And it's more beneficial to the species overall. This is based purely on this picture, right? I was like, oh, that's not at all what was in the book. Right, not even a little bit.
Well, you know what they say, Jackie? You can't judge a book by its cover.
Oh my gosh, do they say that?
Somebody said that.
And I even remember I had the book and I hadn't even read it yet. And somebody's like, what's it about? And I totally said that.
Genetic diversity.
They're like, really?
Inches.
Yeah. And then later they're like, I read the book. It was nothing like that. I'm like, I know, me too. I'm reading it right now.
I think also, from what I understand, the word tribe was chosen because it's a word that's used within the autism rights movement. There were groups, especially in the early 90s, that called themselves the tribe. And that was another thing that Silberman talks about in person, is that a lot of this conversation started with people, with adults with autism in the early 90s, getting the internet and being like, wait, do I still have autism? Because I'm an adult, and all of the medical science is about children with autism. So I think that's another reason that he just used the term tribe, in that it wasn't his term. It was one that was used already within the world of autism. And yeah, trying to pick that point. It's just, I think it's again, it just goes to show that I don't think he would be that, based on my experience of having seen him and read his heart and soul that's been poured into this book. I think that he is more the type to pick a title based on the group that he's talking about and how they talk about themselves, rather than championing some title that he's invented or coining a new word.
I mean, just again, I know, Danny, you kind of want to make sure that we're not getting too into the book critique versus book discussion, but so a couple more kind of book critique points. So certainly this book was very well lauded when it came out in 2015. It was on a number of best of lists. It won the Bailey Gifford Prize for nonfiction. It says on the book cover, if you have an old version, it won the Samuel Johnson Prize. Just found out the other day they renamed the prize. So I don't know if that means he's won. It's the same prize.
Listed twice.
They renamed it.
Winner of the Samuel Johnson Prize. Winner was the
Bailey Gifford Prize. It's a British prize for nonfiction writing. He won an award for Author of the Year from ARC in 2016. And so a lot of the reviews I read online So, like New York Times review I was looking at, they really loved the book. I think they had some of the same critiques we had of like, sometimes it seems like it's going off a little too long, maybe could have been shorter. I both paradoxically think sometimes it goes on too long, but I wish it were also longer at the same time. Like, I needed more, but also maybe not some of what was in there. I wanted it shorter so that more could be said about some of the other areas. And again, that's, my own, personal bias.
Can I add an anecdote here?
Sure.
So when Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird.
I've stolen this anecdote and I've used it so many times with people.
Well, maybe you all already know what I'm going to say anyway for our listeners. So when Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, she didn't want any editing done to the book. So she added an entire chapter that was completely out of place about Scout's birthday party. And when she submitted it to the editor said, "This book is great, except for this one chapter about Scout's birthday party. I don't think it fits." And she said, "You're right, let's take it out." And that was all the editing that was done to that book. So perhaps Steve Silberman planned for there to be a Scout's birthday party chapter in this book, but the editor left it in.
That ham radio chapter, you got to keep it, Steve. It's the crux of the book.
Or it's an example of the kind of society and the kind of conversations we might live in if we had more neurodiversity in what we talked about.
Right?
I mean, yeah.
I know.
I have ADHD, and so I'm really known for my tangents and being like, what were we talking about? Oh, yeah, let's backtrack 30 minutes to our original point that I got us off of. So, yeah,
I agree with you because I feel like there are several rabbit holes in this book that our author went down, and they're sort of celebratory of going off track.
Yeah.
Right?
If there weren't so many names, I wouldn't have, like, I would only find it annoying when he'd be talking about like a family or a researcher, and then he'd go off on a tangent about a different researcher and not use their full names. And I'm like, wait, who are we talking about right now? So I would lose track. And sometimes they'd be talking about researchers from, maybe 10, 20 years in the past, different continents. And it would make it a little harder to follow what I feel like overall was a very fascinating narrative of sort of the history of where we are in terms of, autism treatments, in terms of our conception as a majority society of what autism is, what the autistic community considers themselves to be in terms of their, continued, work towards, better equality and better services, better balance in our society, and how we can be more neurodiverse. So sometimes it would lose me, and not in a boring way. Like, I don't want to hear about what you're talking about, but I really struggled sometimes with like, who are we talking about now?
Maybe like a family tree would have been helpful,
Yeah, or like a House of
like
Leaves.
A relative.
How sometimes they'd have like House of Leaves. They'd start doing a chapter and then they'd do a bunch of footnotes that were sort of related. Like almost like, I'm going to talk about a different researcher. I'm going to do it in the footnotes now. So you got to read my little footnotes for a while.
Yeah.
Like that almost would have made it easier. Timeline would have been great.
Would have been a little, because I would lose track of who we were talking about and what time period I was in.
Yeah.
But I'm not very good with names.
I think that connects to the fact that he's a science journalist used to writing articles in magazines, because each one of these chapters kind of has that feeling, but then tying it all together, it's like, whoa, this is a lot of information.
Yeah,
it is.
I actually noticed when I was reading it that I would read it in the chunks, right? And then I couldn't go chapter to chapter because I lose myself. So I would have to stop at the end of a chapter or at one of like the within chapters, right? When they're like the Roman numerals, I would stop, like walk away and come back and be like, all right, what am I going to read now? As if it was like a new book. That did help though, because then each chapter was kind of like a new start, as if I was doing the research myself, which is kind of what it felt like to me, right? That he had like in his office, he had like stacks of paper and he was like, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, right?
She's picking up the papers, everyone.
Yep.
You definitely could read this book as, I'm curious about the history of where the diagnosis of autism even came from. Oh, read these 3 chapters, you got the whole story. Or I'm curious about this, sort of the burgeoning field of neurodiversity advocacy. Oh, okay, well, these 2 chapters, cover most of what you're going to need. Like, you can read the whole book, but you could just read these 2. You're going to get about 80% of what you want to know. And so in that regard, I think it is sort of funny in that it's not a textbook. It's not a series of magazine articles. It's a science book, but it also kind of doubles as a modular series of not exactly vignettes, but stories.
It's a science journalism book. That's what
That's it.
It's got. You've got to balance giving someone a narrative so that you access, and then throwing all the psychological researchers' names out there for the people that want to be, oh, what did they do? Mm. And then, they can go down that path themselves. Mm. Yeah. And I think the big thing is there's not a book like this before he publishes it. There's not a book where you can go, what is the story of autism in terms of the history of the diagnosis? What treatments are out there and which ones are kind of quackish? Yeah. So he really is having to spin a lot of plates in writing this.
That's very true. Just to finish up kind of discussion of any sort of criticisms of the book, I went on Amazon and I said, what do general readers think of, after I looked at the main publishers, what do Amazon readers look like? And it did seem like there were groups that loved the book. Then there the folks that would sort of give it like the 1-star reviews, because you're always curious, who's given anything a 1? Like you have to really hate something.
Didn't come on time.
Well, yeah, my book was damaged when a lot of it seemed to be, there were actually it seemed like autistic individuals who disliked the book from the standpoint of kind of, nothing with us without us. You're going to tell me the story of where autism came from. You're going to talk to me about advocacy and the growth of advocacy. And while I do understand, I can't understand that point because I'm not coming from that perspective and that history. It is one of those situations of it would have been great to have an autistic individual write a book like this. But, as it hadn't happened, isn't it better that somebody started this ball rolling of like putting a lot of this information all in one place for the majority of individuals to read and learn about so that we can get, more scholarly work in this vein later on? Again, that's my 2 cents and they account for that much. Like I could see why that would be a criticism. Anti-vaxxers did not like this book. Even though they didn't even spend a ton of time. I was surprised. I mean, because I know when we were coming up, it was all anyone was talking about was Andrew Wakefield, gut theory. And it felt like it was almost a footnote in this giant book. Like it didn't come up very much. And I was shocked because it felt like 90% of my learning about autism when I was, starting out in special education and behavior analysis, it's like all we were talking about for that. I guess, the grand scheme of things was like, a couple of years. Period. Yeah. That perfect storm time.
He references it. Yeah.
Yeah. When having seen him in person, when he talks about that area, he's very succinct. Andrew Wakefield lied.
Yeah.
That's all we have to say about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess with historical perspective, you're right, Alan. Like we don't need to spend a lot of time like, and then this, it's like, you know what? It's a lie. It didn't count. Why are we going to talk about it too much?
If you want to read a pretty thorough and I think interesting account of the Autism Wars, you can read Autism's False Prophets by Paul Offit. He does a really good job.
Is there a book called Autism Wars, though?
Not that I know of. Let's not name it that.
Oh, I don't know. That sounds like, ooh.
And then recently I was reading an article about COVID vaccines, and Paul Offit was quoted. I was like, oh, look at that. Still getting work.
There was one other group, and this actually was, I think it was a researcher from Johns Hopkins who also was a little critical of this book. And I kind of saw his point in that he did get the sense that Steve Silberman actively hated Leo Connor, like had like a personal beef with him. And while I do think he tried to be like, I'm going to just share the information, I'm just sharing the facts, it was really hard not to read any section or any part with Leo Connor and not feel like Steve Silberman's like, this guy, I hate this guy. Like he just seems so angry at him.
Well, quite frankly, good, because Leo Connor gave us some of the worst ideas about what caused autism that would every 10 years come back up. I'm working here in Wisconsin. I have heard a school report to a family that, we don't think that they have necessarily autism. We think that you were a cold parent.
What?
Yeah. So
did you check your watch and say, I'm sorry, what year is this? 1972? What are you doing?
Yeah. Like those ideas are out there because of Connor. And so hate on him for perpetrating bad science, especially since he had the Frankls with good science there and he cast it aside.
Yeah, they really came out as real unsung heroes in this book. I actually found some articles afterwards when I was sort of looking up like Frankl. I've like never heard, not Viktor Frankl, who's a psychologist, like famous psychologist. Many people probably read in undergrad psychology, but Georg Frankl and Weiss. And there were like at least 2 think piece recently published articles on like, why is no one talking about how great these folks were? Like they were amazing. Like they really nailed so much of the idea of autism being a spectrum, and in terms of how can we provide treatment to autism that isn't just do what the majority does versus what are the strengths-based approaches that we could use. And it was, we should probably get into the history, because otherwise we're just going to start, going on a tangent about the history we should be talking about.
If someone wants to read more about George or Georg Frankl, there's a great article from European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry from 2020 called George Frankl, An Undervalued Voice in the History of Autism by Filippo Muratori, Sarah Calderoni, and Valeria Bizzari. It's really good. And I'll make sure to share that so that you guys
Thank you. That might have been one of the ones
every time
I saw,
saying,
but it's so great to have the
George,
citation.
it's not pronounced George. That's what you guys are saying.
I believe he was from Vienna, so I believe it's Georg.
Like in The Sound of Music, Georg.
Alan, that is totally where I was thinking of.
But he's often listed as George. It's often been Americanized. But in Silberman's book, he does spell it Georg.
So with no extra E on the end?
Okay. Yeah, at least in the book.
Got it. I missed that. Okay.
One of my favorite parts of this whole discussion of Connor was when he's like, and now he had the perfect opportunity to do what was right. And he didn't. He actually did the exact opposite. That was like 2 sentences, and I was like, "Oh damn!"
No, and I kind of agree. I think we're all kind of in agreement that there were many things that Leo Connor did wrong. I think the only thing that I wasn't even disagreeing. I just wanted to be like, I'm going to be a little critical and think like, could there be more here, or could this be like a minor bias? Is that it did sometimes feel like it was Leo Connor did this because he was an egomaniac and he needed to be at the center of it. That may very well be true, but it's sort of one of those hypotheses that it's so long ago that it's hard to. It might be. It's harder to sort of make that case. And certainly, Steve Silberman might have talked to people. He need to talk to people who I think knew Connor. So it's not totally outside the realm of nope. This is a spot on description of who this man was. But I think it's hard when we talk about like the 40s and start putting, this is why they did it. It's like, that's so long ago. Like, who remembers? But anyway, let's get into the book. So we're not going to go chapter by chapter because as we talked about, some of the chapters are a little bit more, they feel like they're more flavor text, or that's too dismissive. They're sort of hypothesizing and discussing points that I think are great for the thesis of the book, but they themselves might not be great discussion points because there are a lot of there's guesswork. So certainly chapter 1's talking about how long has autism been in our genes? How long has it been in society? How many people have had autism and we didn't know about it, or we called them something else, whether it was schizoid or just mentally ill or crazy or whatever the term was, because we didn't have the interest or the tools to determine it was something else, or we just didn't care back then because we were too busy farming or whatever needed to have happened. And there are a lot of chapters I think that cover that in this book, but they're harder to talk about because there are a lot of it seems like a little bit of guesswork.
Well, the further back you go in history, less you have to go on. Exactly.
I mean, how would it be anything guesswork? Nobody knows Henry Cavendish from the 1700s. They can't tell us what they really thought about him.
I loved that starter story, though.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was actually my favorite chapter in the entire book, I think. I thought it was an excellent chapter to start with, right? Because it laid out, I think, the premise of the book, right? In a really nice way. Because I was like, oh, what are we getting ourselves into? Especially since I thought it was going to be on birds, right? Where I'm coming from. But I loved that chapter because, it highlighted how different contingencies can be at play in an environment, and how that necessarily doesn't matter to the global, like the larger culture, the larger society, right? As long as there is some give and take in society. Mm-hmm. And I just really like that piece. They're like, oh yeah, he hangs out here, right? We know what he's not going to like talk to us. He's going to jump in and out. And that's cool. That's cool. He loves science.
It did read like the Royal, Science Society was sort of understanding of like, this guy was such a genius that it was okay.
Right.
Like, you know what? That's fine. If he doesn't want to talk with us, we'll wait. We'll wait for him. Like we'll be accepting of him in the way he's going to have discourse with us. That was the sense I got.
And I really like that too, because it set the stage so nicely to how that's how society should be, right? We should all be accepting of how everyone is. And, if they don't want to do anything at that moment, let's wait until they're ready. And I think helped me like get into the mindset of the rest of the book and progressively. But I loved that chapter.
Mm.
No, and it's important because it sets us up for the idea that there are certain areas in society that have always been better able to make the rules flexible for people that are different. And the sciences are definitely one of them. And, it also shows that he's a science writer because Cavendish and his story was really in the zeitgeist of like the history of science in the last like 20 years because he is just so different. He's a good character to like go down the rabbit hole to be like, what did this guy do? He's measuring the gravitational constant with real giant lead balls, but also couldn't talk to like women who were in the same room with him. So there's a rich story to be told there that applies to the way that we think about people today. So.
Yeah, and to give everyone background, he only would take walks at night. He wore the same sort of outdated, lavish coat all the time. He only ate the same meals every day, right? He lived alone. And the other thing I thought you were about to say, Alan, was that he came from a very rich family. So eccentricity is for the rich and has been for a long time. Mm-hmm. So variances from social norms are often more accepted and thought of as sort of interesting for folks who have the means by which to live alternate lives, right? Versus if he had not been born into that situation, likely he never would have even had the opportunity to learn the things that he did.
Which is why the 90s Silicon Valley is a nice sort of segue from where we start our story in modern times.
Yes.
Sure.
Hey, everybody, really quick pause for our patrons. I just want to make sure you get the first of the secret code words if you'd like to get CEs for listening to this episode. The first secret code word is SLAN, S-L-A-N. It was a popular science fiction novel, and it was actually mentioned in the book Neurotribes from back in the 40s and 50s. Then SLAN actually became a slang term for someone who was a really big fan of like science fiction. SLAN, S-L-A-N. All right, back to the discussion.
It does sort of point to the sad reality of how as long as you can offer something to everybody else, we'll forgive you for being different. We'll be okay with your differences. And while I do think Steve Silberman tried to make sure that it was clear that it wasn't all like he's not going to tell us a book about all the Henry Cavendishes through history, this is autism. It's people who can measure the weight of the earth, before. I do feel that the book skewed more towards telling anecdotes about individuals with, either they excelled in a field or they were a part of a community that valued their intelligence, despite the disability. There weren't as many, I think, anecdotes about the families with children who struggled to be able to demonstrate their strengths, that all anyone is thinking about is weaknesses, because it's just what's that on the surface is what the providers and what other individuals are seeing. So in that regard, it is sad that so much of what we're willing, as a majority, a neurodiverse majority, to say, yes, this is acceptable, is still, I think, even those of us who are really trying to make sure that we're taking neurodiversity into account, is still based somewhat on, if we can see a value, of course we believe in neurodiversity, and it's only when we can't. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But no, I'm just saying, no, I'm not saying that that's a big hooray and that's what we should do. I'm speaking to, it is, kind of a sad factor. And while I don't think this book is trying to paint a picture of like, that's autism, Henry Cavendish's of the world, they did, similar to like when we talk about Asperger and the patients he would talk about serving, he only talked about the ones that had high functioning skills. And that's why we think of Asperger's as, it's the high functioning autism.
Yeah, which also is not a great term.
No. And we get into that too.
Okay.
But he'd seen plenty of patients who would be sort of what had been categorized as, low functioning, or they didn't have good communication, or they didn't have a lot of, academic skills or areas of like a noticeable scientific interest. He just didn't talk about them. And we can get into that because of the historical context of why he wouldn't have, because he lived in Nazi Germany. So you don't want to be talking about people with disabilities if you want those people to not be euthanized.
And he's also, affiliated with the Nazi Party himself and may have some problematic ideas about eugenics. But on a flip side, because there was some serious psychology there, those cases are perhaps interesting when you're trying to create a diagnosis out of nothing, out of no clear, that these children and young adults and adolescents struggle with the same basic skills, just not to the same degree, but they're just having enough issues integrating into society that they come across my desk. They come into our clinic. And so there is something to be said about like, this is the sort of first line. This is where the boundary is. And I think that's another reason he did talk about them, is that it is from a psychology professional publishing point of view, no one had done that. No one had defined like, here is a dividing line to where we might need to start providing supports. I don't know if Asperger did that, but I can see that in some of what Frankl and he and several other people were doing at the time.
Mm. So we move out of chapter 1 into our second chapter, which again, I don't think is as much of a hardcore science discussion, because it is very much a vignette of, I think, for those of us who've worked with families with a child with autism, this is sort of, it read like, oh my God, I know these people. I've worked with this family. I've worked with a child with these challenges and these strengths and these areas of deficit.
It's called The Boy Who Loves Green Straws.
The Boy Who Loves Green Straws.
My second favorite chapter.
I really am glad you didn't start with this chapter, because the first section had there was a quality to it that I would have thought I was reading like a family memoir, not a science book, because it is much. It starts off very much just like, here's what goes on in the day. And then I feel like I'm reading some sort of like a clickbait article. And then as you keep reading into the chapter, I think it paints like a very thorough picture of the things that went well for the Rosas family he's discussing, things that went well for the family, things that have not gone well, how they developed where they are with their child. They came to, let's focus on our son Leo's strengths. But that wasn't where they started from. It wasn't like, we've loved our son with all our might, all our life. It really painted a thorough picture of the challenges that they had to face. And he doesn't give any years, but from sort of talking about some of the years of like when the family or when the Roses got married and started having kids, this seemed like it was sort of a late 90s, early 2000s family. And reading this, I was shocked. I mean, maybe it's because I'm so old now, but it felt like you could have been reading about the struggles of a family from the 70s or the 80s. It seems like you talk about the 2000s, like, oh, didn't we have it all settled? Didn't we all know what we were doing back then? And then you have to stop and say, no, we just started. We just finished passing autism insurance reform laws. Like that just happened last year. We got all 50 states. So, there's a lot to still be done.
Well, and thinking about his audience, the timelessness or the difficulty in placing this in time is perhaps helpful, because he's saying that these are struggles that families who have children with the autism diagnosis are going to have had, will continue to have for a very long time. And that's a big part of his audience. And he knew that because of the response he got to his prior article. So that sort of fuels why he wrote this, is that there were people asking him, tell us, because I need to hear about this. I don't know where to go to hear about success for my family.
I liked this chapter a lot. I actually assigned it for my students as a bonus piece for them to look at, because I was looking for something that could sort of sum up the experience of a family with an autistic child and some of the challenges of not knowing what's good advice, what's not good advice, and what felt to me like there was an emergency type of quality for them of like, how are we going to figure this out? We have to do something now type of thing. And kind of watching their journey through that chapter for me hit on a lot of important points that I want my students to understand as best they can currently of what it might be like to try to navigate these waters, which are extremely unclear even now.
And I was also, I thought it was, I don't know if it was brave. I'm probably more brave on the part of the family that they were willing to be so open with the steps they took, because there's a whole section in sort of talking about when they were involved with like the DAN network and like BioSet, which just the idea of how we're going to use what we would consider pseudoscientific, medicines and treatments to cure our son's autism or child's autism. And, Shannon, the mom, was very clear. Like, she became like hardcore anti-vaxxer. She was going on message boards. She was like attacking other families. And then realizing, coming to the realization that so many of the people who were, I can't remember, I think it was this chapter, and so many people who were prescribing all these things for her child, they seemed like they were in cahoots. Like they were making referrals to their wife, who was also a doctor. And I think there was like a moment she realized that, the picture that her primary doctor was giving her all these supplements and things of the child on the desk was the same one as the doctor that she'd been referred to do some other sort of testing. And she realized like what's going, like these people are, it's like a con. It's a shell game here, little nepotism. So in that regard, but I think that's so true of families. They just want to help their child. They don't know what to do. And, like you said, Alan, that timelessness, you'd like to think, well, everyone knows what to do now, right? But I bet you're right. There are still families that I'm sure they're working with medical professionals that are sort of, hey, you said it yourself, Alan, still getting I think it's a refrigerator mother syndrome. That's the reason. Like, that's shocking to me. But you're right. The timelessness does point to that feeling of nobody seems to know what's going on. They just keep telling me to do things. I just want to help my child. And I don't know, like I'm jumping from treatment to therapy. And I just don't know. I don't know what to do. And just that development of finding that piece of, okay, this is what's working for my family. Therefore, this is what's important to me. And it's maybe not always going to be, I know ethically we have to always be promoting behavior analysis, but maybe for some families, it's not always going to be behavior analysis.
That's okay. Can you imagine, though, going to the doctor and seeing your other doctor and their kid on the desk? When I read that,
it sounds like a horror story. It's like a twist in the story.
Right? Like, it hurt me in the heart, like, so bad. And they're like, oh, yeah, this is the referral. And turns out they're married. Oh. That, like, when I read that, like, I felt nauseous. Like, that's like a tiny, tiny thing that could go unnoticed, especially during the anxiety-provoking situations that these parents are in, right? When their kids are sick and their kids aren't doing well and they just wanted them to be better, right? To notice that, like, one tiny thing, right? And, like, kudos for them, like, explaining that story, how the mom was like, we need to do it. The dad was like, let me do some research. And then when they, like, were looking into it more clearly, being like, oh, yeah, this company makes the medicine that you're telling me I need.
You have to use the medicine that my company, but we're going to make sure, you know what? I want to make sure that we know we're using the right medicine. Let me refer you to another company that is my other company I own, in which I do the testing, and there's no baseline for the results, because they're always going to come out as, you're short on whatever pseudoscientific mumbo jumbo. You get too many metals in your diet.
Right. So heavy.
And even the baseline blood test, like, I like that he made that point too, that they went to a doctor. The doctor said, you don't have any allergies and your blood work looks fine.
Yeah.
As behavior analysts, that should speak to us that, and I think we're having that conversation among ourselves of, these families eventually ended up with an ABA therapist and it went pretty well for them.
Right.
Why wasn't that one of the first line interventions that was sought out? And, we obviously don't want to be selling ourselves like these people were, but we need to do a better job of making applied behavior analysis speech language pathology, things like that, the first thing that is pursued by families because and we have to be careful because you were saying that they went to a company that had an internal evaluation that said they needed this, and this. Well, in, ABA, that you could conflate our process of how we go through an autism diagnosis, getting therapy, getting services established. It's the same, looking the same, having that same veneer. And so just learning to be very clear that we are doing things above board, because it is so easy to be sort of wowed, especially when you're desperate for help.
Yeah. And I don't think it ever hurts to, even if you're like, I'm not interested in, I know all about the history of autism and the history of the DSM and the history of treatments, and I'm very up on, the neurodiversity movement. I still feel like chapters like this are great for BCBAs to reread, because I think it is so easy to forget that the families we're working with are often coming to us at a very difficult, challenging point in their life. And that they are not making decisions based on like, well, I'm mean, or I'm angry, or I don't like you, because like they are just trying to do what the best that they can, and they are, they're often giving so much either incorrect or ignorant information, and they're just, and just always making sure to be empathetic and not taking it personally, not getting frustrated, like you said, Alan, not trying to oversell what it is that we're going to offer, because they've probably already been oversold and had bad experience with, no, do this bleach enema. That's gonna cure that autism right up. And just had to deal with so much of that. It was so sad hearing about like their son Leo and how they cut all his food out because they were doing the gluten casein-free diet, and how poor Leo actually started to increase his vocabulary because he was suddenly manding for all of the things he no longer was allowed to have because they were trying all these diets out. And while on the one hand, you're like, oh, that's great that, the MO changed, that mans were able to, it's just so sad to think the only thing that got this poor boy speaking more was like the total removal of everything he wanted to eat. And, the parents weren't doing it to be mean or trying to, keep him at a low feeding weight so that reinforcement would work better. They thought that this was a therapy that was going to help their son.
Yeah. And to, put this in context, I think of other chapters in the book, families may seek out ABA if they are hoping to, quote unquote, cure their child, right? Because hopefully we get to that chapter where we get to talk about the history here. And I think that there are lots of folks in our field who are moving in the right direction, right? And the end of this chapter is not that Leo is cured, right? But that they found a way to help him and do so in the context of accepting him for who he is. And that's the most important piece there. And I think trying to square that with families who may be coming to ABA with the perception that this is something that's going to, change my son. And that's not the idea here at all. And that's a perception of our field that has to continue to change. We're not here to cure anyone. We're not here to make anyone not autistic. We're here to teach people what they need to live how they want to live, right?
Silberman has a great quote at the end of the chapter, which is making peace with autism by viewing it as a lifelong disability that deserves support rather than as disease of childhood that can be cured seems like a new and radical idea, but it is in fact the oldest idea in autism research.
Yeah.
I love that.
It's shocking. There's so many ideas. I feel like we're living in the age of everything old was dumb and stupid and didn't understand and they didn't get it. But when you look back at so many, there are a lot of like unsung pioneers in the medical field that had what we would consider like incredibly modern ideas, like the idea of children being free from restraint as a means of getting compliance. You'd think, oh, well, that idea came out in like the 60s and 70s when we decided to stop spanking our kids. No, that idea came from the 18th century. Like there were hospitals that were trying to, so what can we do to avoid needing to lock up our quote unquote, our crazy or infirm patients? These aren't new ideas. And I think it really is amazingly described in like the next two chapters, 3 and 4, about, kind of Asperger and Connor's work, and how so many of what we would think of as like modern education ideas, strength-based learning. Hey, guess what? You didn't just make that up in the 21st century. These things have been around for over almost 100 years. These ideas, well, actually, they have probably been around in some form in some hospitals for over 100 years. And I love these as sort of history chapters, just how much was lost through so much of the breaking medical treatments being in locations that were then ravaged by World War II.
Well, or being proposed by people who were Jewish and therefore perhaps shouldn't be leading medical science in the opinion of people like Asperger and Connor.
And it was fascinating to think of why, because we always think of like, Vienna, psychoanalysis, all the psychology kind of came from there. And so much of that was because there was a period in history where the majority, the Christian majority, were persecuting the Jewish individuals, and they were only allowed to do jobs like be a doctor, which we think of now as like, oh, what a prestigious job. But it was not a prestigious job when the Jewish community was allowed to have doctors. So that is why we had so many Jewish doctors in the 19th and early 20th century who were proposing so much of what we think of as sort of the underpinnings of what became modern psychology. And then why it was so, this is not the only reason, certainly, but why, World War II was so devastating to a lot of that work, because literally many of those scientists were murdered, in the Holocaust. And it's just one of those pieces of history that you sort of don't. Well, I know I personally never thought about it that way. I sort of thought about like, I don't know, it didn't come to the modern era because something else, I don't know, it just vanished or it didn't exist, because, it's hard to think beyond, the last, especially this year, it's hard to think beyond, 6 months ago, much less, thinking back to the 30s and the 40s. So chapter 3 and 4, I feel like these chapters read like the whole highlights comic Goofus and Gallant of like
Gallant.
Yeah, I like to call him Gallant, of like, Asperger always, treated his patients with a strength-based approach. Like Connor thinks everyone's autistic because of their refrigerator mothers, was kind of the tone. And like you said, Alan, we can't talk about Asperger as only positive things, because he was, a member of the Nazi Party. And whether or not that was because he believed in the Nazi Party or because he knew that to not be a member of the Nazi Party was going to be the end of his career and possibly his life.
And Silberman himself talks about how Asperger is very likely, and I think at this point we know now, he was responsible for things like Action T4, where he was actively involved in that he, whether or not it was good science, he thought he was doing something that was better for his clients and for humanity, because of really racist and inhumane ideas. That doesn't excuse him, and it certainly means that we should take a skeptical eye when we look at the science. But we also can look at people like Frankl and Sister Victorine. Like, these people are fascinating. The Sister Victorine, she sounds like she'd be a great behavior technician to have. Like, she's got this great energy, and it's just like, I don't care that kid is acting differently. I just want to support them. Yeah. So there are lots of heroes that we can find, even if we have to topple the statue of Asperger in the history of like autism research.
A lot of folks in the autistic community are not upset by the loss of the Asperger's title, right? Which happened in the DSM-5 not too long ago, maybe 5 years ago. And I have been under the impression that that was a loss for the community, right? Not having that identification any longer. But I would stand corrected based on what Silberman has written here and what I've read elsewhere as well, that they were happy to no longer be affiliated underneath that. And collapsing it all underneath the larger umbrella of ASD, so PDD, NOS, and Asperger's are no more. If you originally got the diagnosis, you keep it, but anyone moving forward is not going to get that diagnosis now. Collapsing it together has, from my understanding, brought the autistic community together in ways in order to help advocate for maybe nonverbal individuals more and viewing it as a continuous spectrum.
Well, what I don't want to jump too far forward into history, but I think what, at least from this book and from some of the interviews with I think Lorna Wing would be one of the individuals. The challenge then comes into, now we think of, we've got high functioning autism and low functioning autism. And I'd always sort of thought, high functioning, they have lots of skills. Low functioning, don't have so many skills. And that those terms that's not what it's supposed to be describing. Right.
Well, we should let Jackie say what she wants to say first.
Okay.
Mine really was, I wanted to be friends with the sister. So it wasn't like a smart thing to say, but when I was reading it, I was like, wouldn't that be a good friend to have? Right? To be in like your corner.
Whenever I read Frankl, I always think Frankfurter, and then I get hungry. So there's my additional.
Yeah.
I just think
I just shiver with anticipation when I think of Frankfurter.
Very nice. But Rob, to your point about using the terminology of high functioning, low functioning, I think that similar to person first versus identity first language is something that the community is looking to move away from. And maybe this is the point that you were getting to, is that your functioning and at the present moment could change, and certainly does change over the lifetime of an individual.
Yeah.
And people, can be high functioning in some areas and need more support in other areas. So it's not a very clear marker of.
Yeah, well, I think sort of the historical context of where the idea of the spectrum came from, while it could be traced, some of the initial discussions would be traced back to like Georg Frankl, Annie Weiss, and Asperger to this period in time. I think sort of the problem, at least from my perspective as someone when I'm hearing about the spectrum, and it does not sound like that is how it was originally meant to be, is when I think of a spectrum, I think of it like a slider, on a piece of equipment, that it goes from like 0 to 100. And the idea not being that it's like, it goes from you have a lot of deficits to very few deficits, that it is more just trying to capture how there are so many differences in, the experience of an autistic individual, rather than like, this person's on this end, which means they can't do all these things. Like we check off all the things they can't do. When you go here, you have less checks of what you can't do. And that's not how it was meant to be. And I think that this speaks to the like real strength-based focus of like I'm going to pronounce it wrong, the Hell Pedagogic Station that's discussed, or that special ed unit where there was a lot of that strength-based learning, which again sounds like something, when was that invented? Probably like last year. It's a pretty new idea. Oh no, it is. I think they're talking about some people in like 1911, the children's clinic run by Erwin Lazar wrote down that they actually focused on the idea that, kids have problem behavior because of the response that society has to who they are. And if we speak to their needs and their strengths, they'll do much better. And again, does that sound like an idea that like, that probably was invented in maybe the 90s, probably the late 90s, right? There's no way.
The 2000s. That's not even 90s.
That's you have to be pretty woke to think that idea, right?
That's like mom gene territory.
I love my side part, and I'm not going to let it go.
Same, me neither.
Right. So, because what he's doing here over these next few chapters is tracing or delineating the process by which we develop the diagnosis of ASD. Mm-hmm. So prior to that, it wasn't necessarily underneath the realm of psychiatry and the medical model. No one really had a name for this particular thing, right? But in putting it into this category and creating a diagnosis for it then pushed it over into psychology and psychiatry, right? And in the much later chapter, I don't know which one, he goes through the DSM history.
It's 9 or 10, I think.
It's way later, yeah. He's going through the DSM history, right? And the taking it into that realm kind of derails this whole process of thinking about a strengths-based approach, right? Because the medical model is always focused on a deficit-based approach, right? And if it's something that can be changed or taken out from a person, right, then that would be better for them. So the pushback is kind of come full circle in recent years and saying this isn't something that needs to be taken out or removed from a person. I'm not a person with autism. I'm an autistic person that can't be taken away from who I am, right? Rather, we need to look at the interactions between the individual and the environment and see if there are changes based on what our societal norms are that could be reframed such that we can better support this person in the setting versus changing that person.
Mm.
That's one of our codes is to make changes in the environment that make ABA services unnecessary. I think that's an underused and undervalued part of what we're supposed to do. And even in special education, eventually I would like to have students not have to have an IEP, or you're looking at the RTI model. Let's get interventions when they're young and the needs are mild so that they never have to have a special education diagnosis and fall down that rabbit hole and end up in, ghettoized education. It's a problem that we still have. So,
why is it always, what's the solution to make this kid do what everyone else is doing? Why is it always that? Because the answer is always, well, all these extra things, all these extra scaffolds, and for what purpose? So that we don't have to make anyone else do anything different.
Right.
And while sometimes that might be a component or, a necessary component of a child's plan, it does always feel like we're coming at it from like, well, if only they could be like everybody else, this wouldn't be a problem. Like, no, duh. Yeah, of course, that makes sense. But is that really the way we want to provide treatment? I mean, it's not like, oh, well, you're sick. You have a bacteria that everyone else doesn't have. Well, we'll give you this medicine. The bacteria will go away. It's not the same, but we do keep going back to this medical model. But again, I think it's kind of beside. Well, it's similar to, but sort of beside sort of the historical context. Did you all love just the amount of nitty gritty discussion, or find it so fascinating to think about where did the term autism come from? Where, when was it first used? The idea of autistic thinking actually being a phrase that was used before the idea of a diagnosis of autism was in any of the, on the books or in the DSM. And it really was, I wrote it down because I was like, I want to remember this. This seems like a good trivia point. It was coined by a Bueller, and it refers to the idea of an individual thinking, not spelled the same. He might have taken a day off, but
it's Bloiler, by the way.
Bloiler, thank you, Alan. Bloiler. Oh, geez, it's not an I, it's an L. Sorry, Bloiler. As self-centered rumination and retreat into fantasy. So it wasn't meant to be, oh, this describes a diagnosis. It was meant to sort of kind of somewhat pejoratively talk about how someone reacts. Like, all they're thinking about is their own internal world.
It's like daydreaming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little more considered to be a little more pernicious by, Bloiler in terms of his, original use of the term.
Well, and that goes back into like the term idiot, which, we would not, was medicalized and then like the sort of even into the 19th century. At the base, that just means someone who's concerned with their own affairs because they are unable to participate in civic life. Mm. That's the base meaning of that word. And you can see the connection, but you can also see like, someone was using some problematic ideas to form that concept of autismus.
Yep. Mm. And a lot of these chapters, I think, read very much as if only, if only World War II hadn't happened, if only so many, strong personalities hadn't made it more important that they get their names in all the textbooks than actually come up with more effective treatments. We could have sped up this, maybe we could have sped up sort of the process and gotten to a more mature idea of neurodiversity so much earlier and saved all these families and individuals so much pain from a society sort of just wanting to pigeonhole them or ghettoize them. Because, you've got in 43, you've got Asperger's describing some of the cases he was working with. And sort of, the funny thing is sort of we think about, so much of history has been autism as a childhood. It's a childhood psychopathy. It's a childhood disorder. However, it wasn't because the only people or the only individuals who were showing sort of what the signs of what we consider an autistic diagnosis were children. It was more just what was being described. And, Silberman talks about how Asperger focused on some of his patients who were higher functioning I'm going to reuse that term. They engaged in more, that kind of the classical idea of autistic thinking, but they had, good communication. I think you said it back when we started the discussion, Alan, just the idea of they had some deficits, motor skills. They seemed to be missing some of the lessons that kids picked up naturally. And he focused on these patients rather than patients who had little to no communication, engaged in high rates of, kind of challenging behavior, because he was presenting to a bunch of Nazis who, weren't interested in hearing about, people who are taking away from the fatherland and with their disabilities, like we got to get rid of them. He seems to be trying to make a point, or at least that's how Silberman paints his thesis or paints his initial work, is that he was trying to focus on the strengths of these individuals so that it wasn't an immediate, hold on, stop, don't want to hear anymore, sounds like another group that is going to, diffuse our Aryan genealogy, and we got to get rid of them. And again, a lot of the individuals who we would then think of, like Georg Frankl and Weiss, who we'd sort of think of as being kind of at the forefront of strengths-based learning and strengths-based treatment, were fleeing to America at this time. And I'm sure there were a number of others. We mentioned Sister Vittorio, who died in the war, who died in a Victorine, who died in a bombing, an Allied bombing raid. So many individuals who we would probably be spending more time talking about their amazing contributions to the field either died or were totally displaced and sort of at the mercy of wherever they were able to end up during and after World War II, and just so much was missed.
Well, and I like that he's setting up Asperger's as an individual who contributed a lot, but also relied on a team. He has in this chapter, he talks about the clinic that he joined, the however you want to say, Heilpädagogic Station, he joined a staff that were already doing some of these things, including Frankl, Josef Feldner, and Sister Victorine. And we don't want Eichhorn's psychoanalytic whatever about autism. They're doing music, literature, nature study, drama, art, speech therapy, and athletics with these kids because it's what they found that worked, and they wanted them to be successful people and to engage in humanity to the fullest extent. And that's, the fact that that's in the 1920s.
This school sounds amazing. I want to send my kids there. I mean, what an amazing approach. And again, 100 years ago.
I want to send myself there.
I know. I want to go to a place where they're like, you know what? I know you have a hard time with some of these skills, Rob. Don't worry about it. What are you great at? We're gonna hone those skills. You're always gonna feel like you're learning something new, and we're gonna help you figure out what is keeping you from being maximally happy or maximally able to access your skills, because you do need to do that. But that's not the focus. It's not like if only we could teach you to deal with your weaknesses, you'd be able to be a member of society. Like that's not that shouldn't be anyone's, educational goal with any individual. And I think even today, with our modern sensibilities, we still focus on weaknesses, and we still focus on why can't you just be like everybody else?
One thing that made me fairly sad in this chapter was when they talked about kids going to state hospitals, right? And how the care dramatically changed, right?
Well, that's a theme in almost every single chapter. If you hear state hospital, the next sentence is going to be about how horrible an experience it was.
Yeah.
And how
or they died of pneumonia.
They're just debilitating. There's so many stories about like patients, like even some of Connor's original, one of the original, patients, Donald Triplett, who was sort of like the first patient he saw, who would then sort of, him and his team, start describing the idea of, childhood autism, how when they keep coming back to him in sort of the narrative that Silberman's putting out, how it feels like, oh, did he end up in a hospital or did he end up getting this therapy? And it's like, no, he moved in with like an older couple and they just, worked on a farm and they just, let him do the things that he was good at. And then sort of seemed like paired the things he was, struggling with the things he was good at. And they gave him, jobs to do so that he was always, working on his strengths, but they also, helped him with what's keeping him from engaging in those strengths more often. And things were going great, and it wasn't any magical therapy. It was just two caring individuals. And I know that I know that it would be, I think, dismissive of a lot of family struggles. Like, if only you had caring individuals in your life, this would all be fine. But just the gist of, it's not always about like what intensive therapy are we having so much as are we coming with a perspective that allows us to focus on the positive aspects and build on that rather than beat our heads against the wall of why can't you be like this or why isn't this working?
Yeah, and I think, and for that one, they paint the picture that they were just similar to the station that we spoke of. They were capitalizing on things he liked to do, and then found jobs that would be beneficial for the family unit, right? That he could do while engaging in those restrictive or specialized interests, right? And he did make the point that he was like, they love him, but they are very firm, like gently firm with the rules, right?
Yeah. So then we crossed the Atlantic a little bit around the same time in history to talk about Leo Kanner. And yeah, I'm glad to hear you say, Alan, that Silberman definitely was not trying to make any bones about like, I don't really like Leo Kanner, because even, describing some of his early work with the paresis with Native Americans, it sort of paints a picture of this is a guy who was smart. He understood what was going on, but he loved having stories in which he was the star and he was the only one who had any idea what was going on, even though we know that he actually worked with Georg Frankl and Andy Weiss. So it wasn't like he made up all this work. There's a great story about him working with his mentor, Adolf Meyer, who was sort of more of that like Frankl, kind of early days Asperger, one of those individuals who was starting to say, why don't we take more data on our patients? Why don't we actually like move around and see what's going on with our patients and talking to our patients rather than just locking them in a room and letting them die over time? And he wanted to like look at what are the facts of the cases. And I think I think it was Meyer who had some sort of thought with Kanner of like you don't get it. Like I can't remember if Simber, there's something you're missing in some of these stories, or in making your stories. Like you're missing some of the human component.
Kanner was well-intentioned and serious enough to bring Frankl on and participate in that research, but selfish enough to then entirely disregard Frankl's really good ideas and really positive experience and long history of success in the field of helping people with autism and related disabilities to, champion his own theories that were untested and invalid.
It keeps coming back up too. Like I don't think there's a chapter after the fourth chapter where Kanner doesn't like pop back up like as the elder statesman of autism, and here he is. He's writing the foreword in like Bernie Rimland's book, and there's just always this like again, whether these are the best quotes that Silberman could find, or whether he's like picking the ones that kind of tell the story that as he sees it. But man, everything this guy says, I don't think he says anything that isn't just this ego-filled statement, of anyone that he was associated with that later he didn't want to be associated with. Like they didn't know what I was talking about. They didn't get my autism. He just had this ownership. It seemingly, at least in the interviews, had this ownership of autism that he fought for. I think there's sections that are describing his. I don't think I wrote it down, but sort of Kanner's kind of fight with one of the researchers who's working with schizophrenia at the time, or schizoid personality, and how they pretty much were seeing exactly the same thing. But because of these two big personalities, they sort of had to compartmentalize which one's autism and which one's schizophrenia. And you're like, wait a minute, hold on. I thought these were like very specific, well-researched conditions. It's like, oh no, two people just decided that we're going to define this as schizophrenia because that's the research I'm doing. And we're going to define this as childhood autism because that's the research I'm doing. And it was just so very arbitrary and potentially detrimental to individuals who then were like, well, that's great that you've said my child has X or Y. Now what? It was like, why we forgot that part. We just need to make sure we named them correctly so that we can get all the credit later on. I mean, and this chapter does read very much like that. Like the focus was on who's going to be responsible for finding these amazing discoveries, less so, okay, so now what? What do we do? How are we helping families? How are we helping children?
Louise Despert is the name of the psychiatrist
Thank you.
that he argues with. I think it's important that we talk about Asperger and Connor a lot, but we really need to be talking about people like Despert and Frankl, because they were doing really awesome things and got wiped under the rug by, I'll say by straight, probably white men who were Protestant and wanted to be rich and powerful. And these are women and people who are not Christian being swept aside in the history of science, which is a big, major problem. And it explains why we have the problems we have today in the field of autism intervention and research.
Boom. Done.
Mic drop. Yeah.
All right, let's move on.
All right.
The other thing to keep in mind at this point is that everyone thought autism was still really rare.
Even though, Connor himself would say that, well, I only see the really tough cases. So the numbers that he would quote, I think like he'd seen 100 patients after some number of years. He picked the patients he would see, and he only wanted the ones like in the book. If they're interesting, like the interesting cases
that fit his description.
Yeah.
He said an average of 7 patients per year. Weirdly remember that.
That's not very many.
No.
That we get the diagnosis. Yeah.
And again, so his paper in 43, Autistic Disturbances of Effective Content, an issue of The Nervous Child. He described 11 patients, and he didn't mean it as a diagnostic article. Silberman writes just sort of describing some of the patterns he was seeing, but it pretty much became what everyone thought was autism. And I don't think it doesn't seem like Connor was going to shy away from the fact that, like, nope, I wrote this paper. I'm in charge of these descriptions, and spent much of his career saying, like, these cases, this is autism. And I don't want to hear about other cases that don't fit the hole, the square pegs in the round hole. I don't want to hear it. And that leads us into what's the cause of autism? Because again, you have a disorder, you have to try to figure out, well, why is it there? Because the medical model was becoming increasingly popular post World War II. I think, with so much work being done with, say, antibiotics and medical treatment for diseases that used to just ravage populations, everything fell under what's the magic bullet that will cure this problem? And even though, we now understand that the brain is incredibly complex and we don't understand it as much as we would need to be able to say we've got a magic bullet or a cure or take this pill or engage in this activity or do this surgery and it'll take care of that, whatever it might be. That was the thought process of what is the reason? And it wasn't Connor. I'm looking here in my notes here. Because, we sort of have a period of time where we've got autism and we've got schizophrenia are sort of becoming the scourge of diagnosis. Not a lot of children were getting diagnosed with autism. A lot of children were being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And most likely many of those children would now have been, with our modern lens, have been diagnosed with autism back then, but they were falling under the category of schizophrenia.
But
childhood schizophrenia.
Childhood schizophrenia. Yes, childhood schizophrenia. Yes, thank you, Alan. That is a very good point.
Most folks were just getting a general ID type diagnosis.
Yes.
Not talked about in this chapter, but just to clarify, it's not like everyone who would get an autism diagnosis now is getting a schizophrenia diagnosis. Lots and lots of folks were just told your child has developmental disability.
Yeah, they're delayed.
Yeah. And, we started seeing, the rise of psychiatry, especially here in America. And, Silberman kind of hypothesizes that part of the reason that, the field spent so much time blaming parents for autism was because, well, if it's a parenting problem, the psychiatry can help. And whether or not that was out of, meant to be altruistic, whether it was meant to make money, probably a little bit of both. I might, err on the side of cynicism towards humanity and say probably more the
feeling
money.
Quite cynical about that.
But whereas if it's a genetic problem, well, there's nothing we can do. I'm sorry, your child has blank. But again, not even focusing on what's the meaningful treatment. It's like, if it's genetic, they're doomed. There's nothing we can do. But if we blame somebody, now they can get on our couches for how I think some of the patients are hearing like 12 to 17 years of analysis with the families.
But isn't that is one thing that Freud and psychiatrists did bring, is the idea that these problems are not essential and immutable. You can get therapy for them. We moved beyond that in other ways, but that is an important contribution, that if you want to be positive about these people, they were trying to say that we could fix these things. It is a little self-serving to say, and we're the only ones who can do that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Alan, you're so positive. I'm so glad you're here. I feel like the rest of us are really getting mired in cynicism.
I'm a very cynical person, but I try. So you have to be positive and give people attributions for what they did right, so that when you criticize them about what they did wrong, it hammers home twice as hard.
Okay, that's a good point. It's a good point. So I think when we're talking about sort of the parenting theory of autism, that actually came not from Connor exactly, but there was a Dr. Bettelheim who sort of became like the Dr. Oz of his time. He was like really popular, giving lots of lectures, psychoanalyst, who it does not sound like was qualified to practice psychology or psychoanalysis of any kind, but was very popular and wanted to talk about how parents were a cause of autism. However, Connor did make the quote about refrigerator parents does come from a quote he made about how the children were kept neatly in a refrigerator which didn't defrost by parents who were cold perfectionists in the late 40s. I think 48 was when that kind of quote was ascribed to him.
So
in the book.
When I read this, I thought Bettelheim had the son with autism and he was an advocate. Did I read that wrong?
That's Rimland. That's Bernie Rimland.
Oh, yep, wrong guy.
We're getting there.
There's a lot of names. There are a lot of names. There are a lot of individuals. They come pretty hard and fast.
You're right.
So so Bettelheim is out there publishing about toxic parenting. Silberman does say that Connor did make like almost like a footnote, like, well, maybe parent. I think there might be some other things in parenting, maybe a genetic component, or however they would have phrased genetic component back in the late 40s, but then kind of went along with the whole parenting thing. Again, Silberman would point to probably because he wanted to stay relevant in the discussion. And if he started saying, no, this very popular individual who's saying it's all about toxic parenting is wrong, he wouldn't have been able to maintain the ownership over the autism sort of bubble he kind of created for himself. I think this chapter goes a lot into just how so many kids were then, what do they call it? The parentectomy. The idea of we got to put this kid in the hospital because you're a bad parent, and that's why your kid has childhood schizophrenia, or that's why your child has childhood autism. They have to go to the hospital because you're making their lives miserable. And then they go to the hospital and just be given whatever treatment the doctor said. This is ECT, subcoma insulin shock. I'm going to give you those first generation antipsychotics, which, there's so many horror stories about how, what a terrible effect those had on individuals in hospitals. LSD, hey, whatever, sure, let's give that a shot. That might have some curative property, right? And you didn't have informed consent. So once you were in the hospital, you just got whatever treatment seemed like, hey, maybe this will work. Let's give this a shot. And surprise, surprise, the outcomes of individuals in state hospitals were pretty horrible.
That's the source of the phrase evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based practice is for medicine. It seems odd to me that in the 50s, 60s, 70s and on, doctors start saying, well, maybe we should base our practice on evidence and hardcore research and replicating good practice. And having like ongoing professional development to update our toolkits. So,
Alan, I went to school at a fancy Vienna university. I think I know what I'm doing. I was an art history major who maybe met Freud one time. So I think I'm pretty good at just doing whatever I feel like.
Right. Well,
I'm a gentleman.
And the thing about Bettelheim, and the thing about Bettelheim is that he was a Jewish, much like Frankl, he was Jewish. He was trained in psychoanalysis, and he got traumatized, I would guess. Like, I hate to apply that term loosely, but in his theory, Silberman says that where Connor saw a refrigerator, Bettelheim saw a concentration camp with a mother as commandant. Like that is, if that's represented in what Bettelheim wrote, and Silberman is not just being, describing that with a flourish, that's, like I can see why that would be problematic and why it would be vivid and attractive, because it does sound like, well, we can fix this by just having less authoritarian parenting, which would vibe well with some of the like cultural movements of the 50s and 60s, and the idea that we should be, ideals of free love that started in like the 40s and 50s. So there was a receptive audience in the wider culture to that kind of message.
Yeah. So, kind of as we continue moving forward into time, we still did see, Frankl was still writing. I mean, he was still occasionally, able to publish, or actually it mentioned a lot of unpublished works that probably would have resonated with us as readers nowadays. The idea of the continuum and autism, trying to sort of conceptualize like what is autism, and really busting out of the very narrow early infantile autism description that existed for so many years. I was shocked at how many anecdotes there were of children who had originally, even like the triplets, who had originally been, I think I mentioned earlier, originally been Connor's patient, who without being in a hospital actually had a pretty decent outcome. And I'm sure that was not the case for all children who then did not go into a hospital, that it wasn't like they had a magical, amazing outcome. But it does feel like, at least from the descriptions here, that even if they'd received no treatment, they would have been better off than many of the individuals who were placed into the state, into the state hospitals.
I mean, being in an enriched, loving environment can do a lot for you. And, I think throughout the book, and I think the next chapters kind of start to get into that, is they're looking at the idea of where have all the folks with autism been throughout time, right? And I know we're going to do
well, they're not all. We're going to spend so much time on ham radios. They weren't all either in an institution or in a case study written by, Connor or Asperger or, somebody. That there are. I'm just trying to make your point for you, Dad. That's not fair of me. Sorry. You're making it just fine.
It's okay.
But it is. I'll keep going. No.
Well, but they're going to bring in the idea here of neurodiversity, right? So likely throughout history, we've had genetic variances that have been more likely over the generations to produce individuals, not only with autism, but also with other, quote unquote, nerdy skills, right? So we see autism run in families that very often are incredibly smart, have interest in STEM, science, math, science fiction. We're going to do that one next, right? We're going to talk about Star Trek and stuff like that's coming up. And it's, it's certainly possible that the folks in the previous chapter were looking at families that were perhaps more socially awkward and reading into that and saying, oh, they don't know how to socialize with their kids. They don't know how to love their kids. But that was not the case at all. There's many different ways of expressing love and interaction and social interaction can vary.
Well, there are some paradoxical statements that Connor himself would even make in terms of these parents who didn't know what was going on with their children. And I think he even said this about the triplet family. They take these notes, like, what is my child doing? And they'd be like, doctor, I want to share these notes with you because I want you to understand what's going on, because I think this will help you understand, where my child is struggling. And then flipping that around and being like, man, these parents, they're taking so many notes on their kids. This proves the theory that they're overanalyzing their child. And that's why the child has autism, because of all this like hyper focus, and it's driving the child crazy, and it's leading them to all these aberrant behaviors, which just feels like such a slap in the face for these poor families that are they're just trying to figure out what to do, and they think they're being helpful. And that help is now being construed as like, see, this is proof that you're the reason that your child is this way, which is just so awful. And it was such a prevalent concern for, through the 40s, into the 50s, into the 60s. Before we get there, though, do we want to go into chapter 6, the Princes of the Air, which I was very fascinated to learn about the history of pulp magazines, I'm sorry, I don't want to be dismissive. I think you've all made fabulous points. I think before we started recording as to the importance of this chapter, Dinah, you talking about sort of the
I
idea
think
of
it is the
society
birthday party chapter,
having the.
but I still liked it. I really enjoyed reading.
You know, I want to say anyone out there, if you have not read Robert E. Howard's Conan short stories from over 100, they're free because they're like 100 years old. They are amazing. They're so well written. They read like a modern piece of sort of like adventure literature. You know, are they kind of racist because they're over 100 years old? Oh yeah, of course they are, but not quite like Lovecraft levels of racist. So I think they're still considered to be, you can still read them and not have to apologize too much about, I'm sorry, I'm reading this old thing. Yeah.
I haven't read them, so I don't know.
I got them. If you want to make it, I'll grab them. I'll read them to the audience right now.
No, thank you. Perhaps another time.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll invite you.
Nice
I'll invite you to an author reading or non-author reading.
Okay.
All right. So chapter 6 talks about ham radios, pulp magazines. I think it does point to the idea of groups feeling disenfranchised by society and coming up with their own small communities of what we would consider, I think, fandom nowadays, being an old concept. You know, I think we think of fandom as like, well, that didn't happen until the internet, or like Star Trek conventions maybe was the earliest form. But this has been happening for, well, how many years would that be? It's, 80 plus years. These groups
it was just much harder for people to get together and find one another.
Well, they could use their ham radios to do so.
But then they could do it with the ham radio. Exactly. Before that, they only had like newsletters.
Your great-grandfather's internet, the ham radio.
Oh, my friend Krista and I had a ham radio.
Your real ham?
And we would talk to people on it. Mm-hmm.
I remember there's old issues of Avengers where they use a ham radio to try to contact the Avengers. And those are the cutest.
We were just sort of talking earlier about like you have the Royal Society. It's a privileged group of people, but because of that privilege, there is space for people who are very odd to contribute through letter writing. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the YouTuber like Objectivity and Number File. His name is Brady Heron. But they do like they explore in Objectivity. They go into the archives of the Royal Society, and you get to hear about these people, about Cavendish. But I mean, dozens of people. And if we are looking through the lens of this like intense interest and wanting to contribute, they have letters from the 1600s and 1700s of people. I thought that this was a really strange day in weather. And so here are all of my observations about it. And I'm sending it to the president of the Royal Society because they might find it useful. So like there have always been that drive, and the groups, when we start to get public groups dedicated to, topics, whether it's science or literature, people start wanting to contribute, and whether or not they're on the autism spectrum or have ADHD. So, even podcast audiences, we can be really, really hardcore. We come to every book club that is offered.
So yeah, it to some extent, I think you guys are turning me around a little bit on chapter 6 as being the Scout's birthday party of Neurotribes, because when you think later on when you're reading, I think it's the 11th chapter, it's almost a parallel chapter, but it's talking about modern media. It's talking about the use of the internet. So it's sort of one of those things of, well, wasn't it great that there were these groups that could get together over, ham radio and newsletters and like early forms of maybe like zines. But that's so hard to do. I mean, it's not really the reason we made this podcast, because when we say let's get together in person and have a book club, you get like 4 people showing up. When you're like, hey, everybody, I'm just going to put exactly what I was going to talk about that book club on the internet. You're going to get at least 10 people who'll listen. I think it's a few more. I hope it's a few more than that. But you'll get a bigger audience. And I think it's one of the reasons that autism advocacy groups have made such strides, is because they did exactly what was going on here with in the 40s and 50s and 60s. However, they did it in a medium that has so much more range. There's so much less response effort for getting the word out and for being able to publicize and gather groups and have calls to action. That term feels like a new term, but that's probably been around a lot longer. All right, let's move on. So we move into sort of the next couple chapters. I feel like anyone who is not, it was probably around our age or younger, this is where we're going to sort of see, it's like, and this is where autism started. Of course, we learned, no, that's not where it started, you young whippersnappers. But I think the quote unquote modern idea of, autism and, ideas towards neurodiversity, this is sort of the genesis of that sort of chapter in the history of autism. And it really focuses here on, we're going to talk about Bernie Rimland. We're going to talk about Ivar Lovaas, become kind of our protagonist for this next section.
Antagonist.
I do think, unlike with Connor and Asperger, Silberman does see both of these folks as relatively positive figures, though
I don't.
I don't think to the same extent. I mean, he hates Connor the most. If he had to pick, like, who's the villain of Neurotribes, it's Leo Connor. Whereas I think Bernie Rimland, he sort of paints the history of as just a really forward-thinking gentleman who was trying to do right by his son and to help a whole disenfranchised group, who then maybe went a little too far in a direction that that the people he was serving were not interested in following him in terms of going into like the biomedical field. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Lovaas, it's a little bit more like this guy kind of had some good ideas, but he sort of went too far in, use of punishment. I did appreciate that. I don't think Silberman then said, and therefore ABA is all about punishment. Because I think Skinner comes off as a real voice of reason in the book, even though he doesn't have a lot of page
Skinner
count.
Some credit. Mm-hmm.
I wish, because he's very clear, we're talking about strength-based learning. He's very clear that Skinner is in the anti-aversive camp and should have been listened to. Yeah. Which is what we do now with so much of our verbal behavior model of ABA. Rimland comes off as a well-meaning, but goes off on a tangent.
He went a little astray.
Went a little astray. But I think there's a lesson in here for people in ABA that Silberman's just trying to flash, that we think of Lovaas and Risley as really being core to what we're doing, but we should be aware that their names are tainted heavily outside of our field, and that anything we have to learn from them, we should, filter through everything else that we've learned.
Yeah.
So,
I make my students watch those early Lovaas sessions, and everyone is completely put off. Mm-hmm. And then we walk through what was terrible about it.
And it also is, Lovaas here is invented ABA. And I think, we did a whole episode with Gina Green about the history of ABA, and individuals, Michael, Alan, they were engaged in what we would consider ABA practices back in the 50s. So if anyone tells you that, Lovaas invented ABA, that is, he popularized it. He did not invent it. I mean, I think we all know he didn't invent behavior analysis, certainly, but the idea of applying behavior analysis, that is not a concept developed in the late 60s, early 70s by Ivar Lovaas. He used it specifically for the treatment of autism. And many of the practices that we now kind of use as bread and butter came from that work. But please don't say,
but we need to move past a lot of that.
Well, no, yeah, we certainly do. But please don't, for any of you who are listening, you're hopefully not getting, and Ivar Lovaas was the father of all of it. But if you hear it, please correct that. He's a person involved in the history of ABA, but he is not the progenitor of applied behavior analysis, not the first person to apply behavior analysis. And that's in the book, as he is the person who, created ABA. It is in this book. And I did make a note that, nope, that's not the case. I said to no one. I wrote
he continues to be a problematic figure, both inside and outside of the field.
He sort of,
and I think there's a lot of history that we need to spend more time on with our new BCBAs and new folks coming into the field to really round this out and make everyone understand the context from which people see ABA and from which ABA started, of which there is some overlap and some difference, right?
I think this chapter, he does try to, he talks in one page about that the path that Lovaas and Rimland went down was to try to change children to make them socially acceptable.
Yes.
And criticizes that. But then on the next page talks about this is why Lovaas and ABA work. It's like they do some really good things but there are still problems in how they presented their intervention and what their goals were, because he goes into pretty good detail about acquisition trials and extinction trials and gives a pretty good case study of this person and how they were helped, but also how they were harmed by punishment. So I like that Silberman does go out of his way to say this person is a problem, but there is stuff to be learned about from what they did and why ABA is important now and is not quackery, which is important.
Yeah. And, the principles of learning are what they are, right? Like we know what they are because people have studied them, but the decisions on how we're going to apply them and to what behavior and to what end is what needs to be examined extremely carefully. And when you brought up the old white guys, right? Like if we think about what are our social norms, where do they come from? Everything traces back to this medical model. We think about IQ and its derivatives as being the ultimate outcome goals. All of that's coming from the same perspective. We want everyone to, fit into what we expect to be, quote unquote, normal best outcome model. And if we can move ourselves away from that, then we're going to have a lot more flexibility with how we apply the science that we believe in. But first and foremost, we have to remain respectful of the clients that we serve and listen to them and their community.
I do want to give kind of Bernie Rimland some props, and I think Silberman spends a good amount of time talking about all of the benefits he brought to what we think of as treatment for autism. He himself was interested in quantitative measurement psychology. He became interested specifically in learning about autism because his son, Mark, was autistic and would go to the doctor. And I think there was a great quote. They went to a psychotherapist, and the psychotherapist spent the whole session asking the Rimlands, tell me, why do you hate your son? And it would just keep repeating the question over and over, and left Rimland saying, I'm not what is this? Like, I don't hate my kid. And then they had another child who was not autistic, and led him to say, you know what, I have to learn about autism. And boy, I mean, mega props to him as a parent. I think we work with so many parents who go out of their way. They do so much research. He was traveling around. I mean, he had a job that allowed him to travel and go to like university libraries, but he was finding everything there was published about autism. And it resulted in sort of his book, Infantile Autism, the Syndrome and its Implications for a Neural Theory of Behavior in '64, which had an intro by Connor, who, again, Silberman makes a point, wrote like a really obnoxious introduction where he sort of threw Bettelheim in under the bus. Like, no, I never believed that stuff. No, it's totally not. I didn't say that. It's never been the parents. It's totally not, but also then it takes a dig, I think, at poor Rimland, who'd done all this work, to be like, yeah, it's so nice that somebody cares about dinky little autism that I invented and only affects a few people here. They're like, what? God. I mean, yeah, it's hard not to just really want to give Connor a talking to after reading this book. I probably want to do more than that, but
if there's one person that I want to make sure we cover, oh, sorry, Jackie, I just want to make sure that we cover Lorna Wing, because she was the unsung hero of this book for me. When I saw Silberman in person, this person fascinated me, and I loved her chapter because she's awesome.
All right, well, I think in terms of Rimland, he created the first diagnostic kind of checklist for autism that would then, spur other individuals to create things like the ADOS. Maybe it wasn't the most valid test, but hey, he was given it the old college try when nothing else existed. He was, not directly created, but it was involved in some of the creations of some of the first autistic advocacy groups. These were parent groups back then. And eventually, like we said, sort of went down the rabbit hole of gut theory and what role the vaccines have and how can all these medications help my child. And when it came push or shove, he had an ultimatum. And, there was the ultimatum of, I want our advocacy groups to focus on curing autism. Parents wanted to focus on advocating for better services for their children. And that sort of became the schism to some extent in, I think we kind of referred to like the idea of the autism wars, of the idea of, is autism about finding better supports for the children or for other individuals, or is it about curing them? And Rimland unfortunately went down the path of cure, which has led to a lot of dead ends and probably certainly done a lot of harm to a lot of individuals. And then he sort of fades out of the story a little bit. Yeah, we talked a little about Lovaas. I think it's important for folks, if you haven't been in grad school in a long time and the last time you heard about Lovaas was about, the amazing results in his like 87 publication. No one's replicated those results, and a lot of the procedures he used are ones that, and I think we talk a lot just generally on the show about sometimes we're down on procedures, or we're down on sort of themes in research and treatment. And it's not so much that we're down on them because we think they are bad or wrong. We talk about learning is learning. It's more the fact that Lovaas was using punishment so much, it then became like, all anyone learned about was punishment. We should use punishment. And so the lesson learned was, if we use more punishment, we'll get better results. And I think that's always a challenge when individuals don't understand the origin of many of these treatments. They pick and choose the thing that's easiest to do, or is most in line with what they believe to be effective treatment, and then bad outcomes occur.
Yeah, and what I was going to say before is when I read this, when I first learned about the Lovaas studies, he sounded like a great man, but then when you get into it, like when he was like, and I hit her real hard and then I felt great.
On her like fat butt or something. Like
she had a super fat butt. It was an easy target. I was like, that is atrocious. I never want anyone to be subjected to that, right? So that was my point that I was going to bring. I thought we were moving on from Lovaas, but I mean, he's not all like glitter and shine, right? Like that's not okay.
I think he's described something like what Connor is, and sort of like he was a smart guy. He certainly made some useful advancements. He had a great personality, but that doesn't mean he's beyond reproach, and that's an important piece.
A great personality.
I don't think he had a great personality either.
Well, I mean, in the book at least, I never met the guy. I don't know.
I didn't read it that way. I read it that he was kind of a smarmy little asshole. That's how I read it.
Well, I read it. He was like, but the fact that he was a smarmy asshole that people were interested in working with, he had like there was a quality to him. I mean, you can't get by just by being an asshole.
I think you can.
I think you can. I've seen many people get by as assholes, especially.
Well, maybe in business or, investment world. I don't know about the sciences.
Or like the presidency.
There's some of them walking around now.
Yeah, presidency, definitely. I don't know about sciences. You're right.
Our last book review or book club was on the Hart and Risley book, which, Hart and Risley introduced some things. Risley in this book talking about how his early work involved kenneling and feeding troughs and aversives. We need to know about that. We don't need to scrub that from our history. We need to know about it so that we don't overemphasize these people's names. Their positive contributions, yes, but not them as people.
No, I agree on it. You have to. There has to be a level of understanding, and I think it's important. And it's so easy to forget and just sort of like, I'm going to focus on this area because that's what I learned about. And I think we all need to always be checking ourselves. If I'm talking positively about this individual, there's got to be something else I need to know. Like, do I know the whole story to be able to make broad statements about their work and their contribution? Because an individual can contribute to a science, and it's important. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't understand what was important in their contributions and what we learned not to do from their contribution. I think of remember that show Home Improvement with where Tim Allen was like the tool guy? And I remember an episode where he won an award, and the award was for teaching everybody what not to do in regards to home repair. And I think sometimes we should probably think back on some individuals and their contributions. And while there are some positives, a lot of what we learned was what not to do from the work they did.
I felt like Al put up with a lot.
Yeah, same.
Al's a good example of what a neurodiverse society, like he could be our Ubermensch for being calm and patient and just rolling with it.
Yes.
And not caring that someone does something, maddeningly wrong in how they approach a task. But let them go for it because they enjoy it.
All right. So I think we're going to unfortunately not have enough time to talk about a lot of the sections of the book that really get into the advocacy, the increase of the advocacy movement, the rise of parent groups in the country, which are a lot older than I would have thought they were in terms of their origins, some of the conferences that were going on. So we're going to jump a bit ahead because, Alan, I know you want to talk about Lorna Wing, who sort of becomes our third act protagonist in a way, at least in the scientific realm of the book.
Yeah, well, work by her and other people are why we have a much better understanding. The background of Lorna being doing a survey of autism in Britain and finding that, this isn't a rare institutional 5 in 200,000 thing. They're at one person in 100 households meets the criteria that we have. And this is in like the 50s and 60s. That's important because that goes to show the sort of societal ignorance or societal silence about these individuals and how awful it is that there's no role for people in society. If you're pathological enough, you stay at home. But if you're so pathological that you can't stay at home, then you go to an institution. That's horrible. Horrible, horrible, horrible. But something that we kind of deal with today with a lot of our clients being 20 and still working on skills. And if parents don't know how to advocate for rehabilitation services and vocational rehabilitation and using these funds and continuing ABA and pushing through and having schools do vocational and life skill training through the age of 21 like they're supposed to do, parents are still resigned to, my child's always going to live with me. No, they don't have to. They might be 30 before they can live in their own apartment, but that's the goal. We can keep working on it. It's not they're grown up and it's done. And Lorna Wing is an important person who does that because I think just at the end of the chapter, he credits her with the term autism spectrum rather than continuum, and that because she's subversive because her suggestion is that the continuum shades imperceptibly into garden variety eccentricity. So again, there are differences up to a point that we find acceptable, whether it's because of wealth or because of your utility in society. But beyond that, we're going to pathologize you. And I really liked her as a figure in this book. I really think that she's a go-to person for autism intervention and how we're going to model how we think and present what we do and how we're going to help our clients.
And she really was very instrumental. I mean, she had colleagues, I think it was Lynn Waterhouse and Berna Siegel, were instrumental in redefining autism for DSM-3 in 87 to increase the number of individuals who would qualify for services. And I'm trying to think, what were services like in 1987? There certainly aren't the services there now, but that initial push of we need to make sure that the DSM is being used for the purpose of allowing individuals to have a category that can explain sort of, the challenges they're facing so that they can access treatments that otherwise they're going to be told, sorry, you don't qualify under this or that reason. Which is funny. We think of the DSM as being this it's like this amazing document, brought down from the mountain. And it's just some book that people put together. And there was a period where the DSM was a joke. You talk about the DSM, it's like, what? Nobody reads that. Who cares? And it sort of became like this rock star document that, pros and cons to the use of the DSM. But I think the big pro was Lorna Wing and colleagues using it for the purpose that it should be used for, which is how can we make sure that individuals are being seen? Let's get rid of infantile from the diagnosis, because we can't just be giving services to very young children, because we know those aren't the only individuals that are important, that are, would qualify for some of these needs. So again, kind of the beginnings of what we think of as the modern quote unquote diagnosis of autism really came from her work too. And she didn't really get as much, I think, book time as some of the others. I think it might have been just the way it was. I mean, I kind of got the sense from Silberman that he's like, man, I have so much great detail. Oh, whoops, I got to finish this book. Where am I? The 70s. All right, we're gonna rush through that one.
Yeah. Or there's so much to tell here. I'm going to publish this good overview. We don't need to talk about these big figures anymore, but other people should be talking about this. Here's a figure. Run with it. Here's enough to get your appetite for Lorna Wing, and go work on a biography of what she did, or Frankl. That's why I was so excited to find an article just from last year about Frankl being an unsung hero. Like this is a long conversation we're going to continue to have.
Yeah. Wing also pushed for Asperger's to be included in DSM-4. And I think she was still, I think she's passed away now, but I believe Silberman was able to interview her directly before she passed. And, I think she very well understands and reflects on, we were trying to get more services for individuals, and how, the unfortunate side effect of that. I mean, the positive effect was, yes, people are now able to get more services and get a diagnosis so they can get services, but is understanding of, this is probably one of the reasons that we saw all of the push of, it's vaccines causing autism, because now there was no autism and now all of a sudden there is autism. And it's so funny to think of, there's more autism because we wrote the book so that we could diagnose more people with autism. That was a concerted effort. It wasn't like a secret, or it wasn't some sort of unknown that sort of just popped up out of nowhere. And it was just funny to sort of hear her be like, nope, that's why there's more autism. I mean, there always was. I mean, she didn't cause more autism, but that's why we're more aware of its prevalence. It's not because it just appeared in the 80s because of vaccines or pollution. Did anyone, no one here is from Massachusetts. They were talking about pollution in Massachusetts. Did you see that part? I read that part carefully.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Civil action.
And part of that is because Boston, like Vienna of old, was a center of medical research. It was so prevalent in a large city like Boston because that's where our prestigious medical institutions are. It's like San Antonio now is becoming a huge hub of autism research slowly but surely, because the military there's 3 military bases around San Antonio. And so there's tons of military insurance money to be poured into that research now in cities like San Antonio. So yeah, like that's it. To conflate, it's that correlation and causation kind of thing. It's really easy.
Yeah. And Boston's also a tech MIT hub.
Mm-hmm.
Well, right?
We have it all.
Yes, exactly.
We've got pollution. We
have less pollution. They cleaned up Boston Harbor. You guys weren't here at the time, but I remember when our governor jumped into the harbor to demonstrate how much cleaner it was back in the good old 90s. Remember the 90s, everybody? Remember the 90s? I know not everything was great in the 90s, but, there were some positives.
And I was like 12 at the end of the 90s, so I'm maybe not the best person to ask.
Weren't you so happy when you were 12? Remember, Ninja Turtles? And, so great. I don't know. What else happened in the 90s? Who remembers?
Star Trek, all 3 series. Let's go.
You got 3
let's
Star
go back to that other chapter.
That's right. Next Generation, man. And then, I think, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to talk about a lot of the leaders of the advocacy and neurodiversity advocacy groups. But the rise of the internet made that just so much more of a in-your-face reality. And even to the point that I think they have the kind of the anecdote of how which school was trying. There was one of the NYU was putting out ads talking about how autism is capturing your child. And again, their goal was to get parents involved in getting their child a diagnosis, being a part of, I think, the research they were doing. But they were targeting parents, just like, parents, isn't it terrible? Your kid has autism. And the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, one of their first big public cases was, hey, wait a minute, you can't advertise like this. This is not appropriate. Like, you're making it sound like so many autistic individuals, they're trapped and they're not the hero of their own story. You're taking away their ability to advocate for themselves and making it sound like they're they're tragic figures and only their parents and other medical professionals can help them. And that's not an appropriate narrative. And they were able to mobilize individuals to call NYU. And NYU's first responses were like, well, we're just trying to help. Like, I'm so sorry that you're so hurt by this, people. But, they were able to push through. And this back in 2007 when those kinds of mobilizations weren't as, I think, readily effective as they might be considered nowadays. And they were able to get them to take those ads down because they weren't a conversation that was appropriate to have. They speaking without us, kind of that idea.
And Ari Neiman is a well-known autistic self-advocate now as well. And I know we don't have time to go into all of this, but, he talks at length about the development of parent groups that are advocating for support for their autistic children, and then self-advocates who are also advocating for themselves. But he doesn't go into the fact that these two groups are very often at odds with one another in the present day, and I think that that's too bad. I would like for us to find some middle ground here and recognize that it is 100% a spectrum, right? And there are some individuals who are going to continue to need more support, and advocating for their support is appropriate for their parents to do so. And also that spectrum should be inclusive across the board of everyone who is high support or low support, and recognizing that can certainly change over time, and that we can be respectful of those individuals who have more verbal capabilities of speaking to their autistic experience. And, I'm NT, right? So I need to hear those experiences so that I can better understand my own clients if they're not able to share that themselves. And I personally see no reason why we can't listen to both sides of that story and come together to do the best job possible for our clients.
Donna, you're crazy. We don't collaborate anymore. It's important that you just get on the internet and speak as loudly as possible and refuse to collaborate. That's what the last administration taught us all, and those great days of 2016 and 2020.
My absolute favorite place to be.
Yeah, I know you do. And it's sad that the opinion of like, I'm going to collaborate. It's like, ha ha ha, look at you, fool. You're going to collaborate? No, thank you.
I was trying to put on a high note there, Rob.
Yeah, because it is 53.
Oh, okay. So we're just we'll shut it down. No, let's do. We should do final thoughts. Alan, go ahead.
I just want to make sure, I don't want to talk about this at length, but I do want to recognize the people he talks about in chapter 11 in Autistic Space, just a couple, because I think it's really important that we read this whole book about neurotribes and then we don't talk about the people that helped inform the modern movement of autism rights. Obviously talks about Temple Grandin, gives her the respect she deserves and how he addresses how she presents herself and how she advocates for herself and how she talks about herself. Talks about Jim Sinclair and Donna Williams, who are associated with a group called the MAP List, which is like a self-advocacy, self-identified group of people with autism that took a lot of cues from the deaf community and, advocated for, I'm an autistic person because I don't have the disease of autism. Autism is a big part of what I do and is involved in that conversation. I think there was one more. I just wanted to make sure that so Donna Williams, Jim Sinclair. Yeah, because these are people.
I don't know if I'm saying that right. Judy Human.
Yes.
Was a disability advocate, and she's prominently featured in the movie documentary Crip Camp, which I talk about a lot online because I love it so much and it's so good. And anyone who's interested in learning about disability rights should 100% watch it.
Mm-hmm. And Judy Singer, who gave us the word neurodiversity out of her background in anthropology and sociology, and may herself be on the spectrum. And I like how how he's very careful to not be diagnostic in talking about people that aren't diagnosed or that don't necessarily have that diagnosis. So that Judy Singer, because neurodiversity is the word of the hour, and she deserves credit for coining it in the 90s. And in the 90s, that's like less than 30 years ago. This is an important conversation. And that's all I wanted to say. I just want to make sure I recognize some of these people because they are very important to why this book is powerful and needs to be read by people who work in our field and just by society at large.
Yeah, I'm glad you did, and we didn't touch on the fact that neurodiversity is hard to define, right? And it's basically one can include oneself into the category, right? So it's not solely autism. Folks with ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and several others can sort of self-identify into this movement at large, which is looking at different ways of thinking, behavior patterns, varied reinforcers, etc.
Refusing to view autistic people or people with other diagnoses as only in the light of what they can't do. That is moving beyond that model, which is what we've been talking about, and that's the whole point of neurodiversity. She talks about that he talks about that in the afterword.
So I know we're out of time. We've got so many individuals that I know we're all feeling like we gave not as much time as we wanted to the narrative. And we're a specific group. We're the behavior analyst group. So the point of reading this for us to some extent is, okay, why is this important for behavior analysts to read this book, or why wouldn't it be important? So that does color kind of where our discussion focused. But I think this is a good place in kind of wrapping up to say, as behavior analysts, why or why not would you recommend this book? And what about this book did or possibly did not change how you were thinking about your own practice and your own means of supporting other individuals?
Well, I recommended it to the group to read.
And
I voted for it because you made it clear how much you wanted to talk about it.
You should a slam dunk question for you.
I feel like I've already made my point. Sprinkled throughout, but one can only understand the world through your own perspective, and we may all be existing in the same space, but the way that I perceive and experience and think about the world may be vastly different than the person sitting right next to me, and there's no clear way for me to know that, particularly if the person next to me can't tell me that. So for me, the most important thing about this book is recognizing how little we might know about the variance in human experience, and coming into every situation with a new person from a very humble place, and understanding that we just don't know, and we should focus our energies on learning what we can from that individual, as well as what the community at large can tell us. Computer chat, as we all know, you've met one person with autism, right? So we don't want to make vast, sweeping generalization statements. But I am the type of person, in addition to living in the gray, that really, I think, appreciates novelty and variety in life. So this book really spoke to me in thinking about all the different variations of folks that you might encounter. And I feel really privileged to get to work with some of them.
I just want to say that I'm going to be a little revealing here. This book was really powerful for me because I grew up not having a diagnosis of ADHD or ADD, I should say, because I didn't fit the criteria that people assume children have. And so I was just sent off to college, and 4.0 student in high school, what problem could I have? And I got down to a 2.79 and almost lost my scholarship and really struggled. Originally, I was studying to be a historian of science and a librarian. Almost fell out of graduate school because I didn't have the supports I needed. Spent a good 10 years of my life recovering from some really bad depression and anxiety disorders because I didn't have supports growing up and I didn't have the skills identified. And so, yeah, now that I have found my vocation in working in special education and helping people with differences and needs live more independently, those are skills I apply to myself. And I am active on places like Reddit and talk about my success and the skills I've learned as a behavior analyst that help me with my own needs and ongoing needs. And, we talked about there's a future for ABA outside of just being associated with an autism treatment. Things like acceptance and commitment therapy, behavioral activation for the treatment of depression, which comes out of contextual behavioral science. Those are things that are really important and really powerful. I wouldn't be where I am without ABA, not just as a professional, but as a person, because it is a powerful, powerful tool. And this book just was so great to see a subgroup who is different advocate for themselves. And it just made me feel so much less alone, even though I don't have an autism spectrum diagnosis. I am a person with attentional issues. So I just felt really empowered by that. And it really informs the empathy and the compassion that I try to show my clients and anybody I work with, whether or not they have autism or are autistic or not. So
that is powerful. That's okay. I appreciated the historical context because never has it been in one single place, right? Even if it may have been slightly skewed or not, right? We don't know. I appreciated the angle at which the historical context came into play, right? And the greater lens at which we were looking at it. And I think I pulled from that that nothing is new, right? And we have to continually be reflective of the past in order to make changes in the future.
I think to some extent I was probably more critical than the group.
What?
I
don't believe you.
I know you guys. No, it's true. I'm the critical one.
Sucks, basically in the note.
I never said that. That's not good.
No, you didn't.
And I think I was a little up and down reading the book. I'd be reading it and I'd be like, this is exactly it. And then I'd be like, I hate this book. Or this book's not making any sense, or this isn't the point I think it needs to make. So I was sort of all over the place. And some of it's probably going to be just like with anything that we read or do, there's a context. The context is we're recording this in 2021. I read this in early 2021. So I'll be honest, I've been pretty burnt out. I think like almost all of us, really struggling with being able to just get up and deal with the day and do my job in a way that I think speaks to, the professional I want to be. It's a lot more work than it used to be, where I could just get up and go. I mean, I think that's true about so many people. And while I still do have some real
time on your hair.
All right, you know what? It's late. We're recording this, and it's my product's not sticking as well. But reading this book, while I do still have some criticisms, I have some areas. I do think they're mostly in the area of. I wish there were just more. Some areas need to be a little less, and some areas a little more. And part of me now, having so many positive buddies here at our book club, I'm starting to think maybe some of it had to do with Silberman just speaking to history. It's easier to paint a complete picture of something that happened 70 years ago because you've had 70 years to think about it and process it and then create the narrative based on multiple sources, where it's a lot harder to talk about something that happened in 2007 or 2012 because we've only had a few years to sort of process what happened and why, and some of that context isn't there. So maybe there wasn't as much about the back half. Also, because that story isn't finished being written. I mean, it's never going to be finished being written, but we're not able to look back at it and sort of look at the pros and cons. Like you were saying, Diana, there are, challenges to the advocacy groups for autism, because we've got, parent groups, we've got self-advocacy groups, we've got people in between, and they're often at odds. And neither one of them is wrong or bad. They have different perspectives, but it's hard to talk about what those perspectives are because it's still a very new thing that we have those perspectives even being publicized in a way that more, that more individuals who are relevant to that discussion or a part of that discussion can join in and be heard, be seen. So overall, I think very positive. And this book really, it made me remember why I wanted to get in this field. And it was not to solve problems. It was not to hear what's the concern. Let me think about how I'll fix it. That's not my job, is to fix people. My job is to support people and build on what they want and to build on their strength. And I think in a year where it was getting, I wasn't doing that as fluently or as naturally as I wanted to be. I think this book really did sort of galvanize me to say, you know what, that's still the professional I want to be, and it's still the professional I can be. And I care enough about people to want to make that something that it's not a struggle. It shouldn't be a struggle for me to have to remember that. I shouldn't just be focused on, I'll solve this problem and move on to the next problem. I really need to, double down on what I learned and how how my role as a behavior analyst can support others, not to make them better, but to give them the skills that they want so that they are getting to do all they want in their life. It's not my job to solve their problems. And I think this book really does share a lot of history that helps with, kind of rejuvenating that ideal, and also, points to groups that, weren't always at the top of my reading list that really should have been. And so in that regard, it was just the book that I think I needed. So I'm very glad it got voted for, even if Diana rigged the ballot to make it our book. All right, and that brings us to the end of our Neurotribes book club. And I'm getting the wrap it up signal from the producer over there. So if you're listening to this, thank you so much for supporting us on Patreon. We love doing these, and we're so excited, Alan, that you were able to join us for another book club, which means everyone hears this is going to be counting on you coming to the next book club as well.
Don't
TBD.
Make it pressuring.
If he wants to, whatever, it's fine, it's cool, whatever works for you. I don't want to.
If they want me to come back and stay, then someone else better show up. Just to say hi.
You're scaring them off,
faceless
Alan.
Group of people that made me reread a 600-page book and then didn't show up because
Alan.
Yeah, there were other people that voted for this thing.
True. You're
right. Yeah. So they better come back, please.
I think you're scaring them off, Alan. They're like, what? I gotta do Alan level performance? Nope.
No, they just gotta say hi, and then they can leave if they don't want to be in the recording. I will say, if not, see, this is the kind of thing that I bought this book.
Ooh.
The equivalence relations.
I own it.
Yeah, you guys convinced me to buy this in one of your episodes. Mm-hmm. So if we want to read this book, I will push this for a book club, or make the next book club just about this if it's just about me.
Oh no!
I will get back. I
we're
read
gonna have to bring Kaio if we're talking about that.
Yeah, I did read the whole book. I have notes on almost every page. One of the pages, like, when will this book end?
Yeah.
It's so long.
Well, yeah. Then let's let Jackie and I.
By Murray Sidman.
We just run into that book and talk about it for 3 hours, like Robert and I have about this. So, yeah.
Oh, boy. All right. Well, thank you, Alan, for joining. Thank you, Jackie and Diana. Thanks, everyone, for listening and supporting us on Patreon. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll have another poll up in probably another month or two for whatever our next book club will be. I think it's a summertime. But until then, everyone, get a copy of Neurotribes, listen along while you read it. We're like your audible version, right, of the discussion, and keep responding. Bye.
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 We want to again thank all of our patrons for listening to our full-length, super long book club podcast on Neurotribes. None of this would be possible without your support, so we thank you very, very much for signing up for our Patreon. Just as a reminder, you are eligible for 2 CEs at no additional cost for listening to this whole episode. You can just email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com or message us on the Patreon page to let us know you've listened to the Neurotribes book club and have your 2 code words. We do need to have that in place, rules and all that. The second of those code words is Conan, Conan. Conan, the Hyborian warrior from the pulp magazines of the 20s and 30s, or 30s, I think. Conan. Again, thank you very, very much for listening to our whole full-length discussion. We hope that you'll be able to join us again when we do our next book club sometime this summer. Don't forget to look out for the poll for the next choice, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to keep responding. Bye.